name is Alex, and this is Bento Radio. Now, before we get started, I just want to jump into a couple things first, the normal podcast stuff. First, if you like this show, be sure to subscribe to it on whatever app you are listening to it or watching it on. If you're watching it, it's probably YouTube, but if you're listening to it, be sure to subscribe in whatever podcast app of choice you use. And if that podcast app allows a 5-star review, go ahead and leave one of those if you really like the show, because it helps the show. And if you also really like the show, you can go over to the show's website, which is bento-box.ghost.io. That link is available anywhere the show is, meaning it's available in the description of this episode, both on YouTube and in the description of the episode in wherever you're listening to it, if you are listening to the audio version. And it's also available on the YouTube channel page and the podcast and in the general podcast description proper. But on that note, I am drawing ever closer to releasing my app. For people who your first time seeing the opening of one of these things, I have been developing an app for a while now, and last episode I put up an actual video. I might do that again here, but the app is my take on what I would like out of an anime watch list app, because as somebody who endeavors to talk about anime as a medium in some level of thoughtful way, I struggle with the available watch list apps as they are, because they are essentially checklists, and that's totally fine. There is a utility for that, and there are tons of people who want to use that, and I get it. But what I was looking for is something where I could, at an episodic level, take notes for every episode. If you saw the last episode all about Sentenced to be a Hero, I took notes on every single episode. I've taken notes on every single one of the episodes that I've been watching this season, really. But if you haven't seen that episode, be sure to go check it out. I'm pretty happy with it. And hopefully I'll be happy with this one too, considering the subject. And on that note, let's jump into what we're talking about this time. And that is the second season of a show that literally just wrapped up last week, and that is Frieren Season 2. So take it away, with the synopsis.
Season 2 of Frieren Beyond Journey's End continues the story long after the Demon King has already been defeated. Instead of focusing on victory, it explores what comes after, following Frieren as she travels with Fern and Stark across a world still shaped by the legacy of that journey. As they move forward, Frieren begins to reflect more deeply on her time with Himmel and the original hero party. What once felt like distant memories start to carry emotional weight as she slowly realizes how little she understood the people who meant the most to her. Moments that once passed quietly now linger, forcing her to confront feelings she never fully processed. Along the way, the trio encounters new regions, powerful mages, and lingering threats tied to ancient conflicts. These challenges reveal more of Frieren's immense magical ability, while also pushing her into situations where observation is no longer enough, and she has to actively engage with the world around her. At the same time, Fern and Stark continue to grow closer. Their relationship develops in small human ways, awkward, sincere, and deeply personal. Through them, Frieren begins to see the value in fleeting connections, and the importance of being present in moments that won't last forever.
Now, there's a synopsis out of the way. I want to talk about an idea that I heard from a different creator over on, actually, Instagram Reels, when I was just scrolling by. I can't really place it, but I'll see if I can find the video and maybe I'll drop a link in the description. But basically what they said is something has changed specifically with the way people consume media, in that very often now people don't just go to a piece of media and to render themselves to it. And instead they come to a piece of media with a bunch of checklists. And they want to check boxes off a list and say, it meets all these criteria, that means I'm allowed to like it, that means I'm allowed to sit here and enjoy it, and that means it qualifies as good. And then I get to make the next leap of if it's great. And I think she's probably right, more than any of us are willing to admit. Lots of us do this even without realizing it. I am predisposed to a thing like Frieren because of what I like, and even if I'm not fully bringing that stuff to the show, I am more likely to give it a chance because I have the background of having watched stuff where I would jive with it. Now, that's not to say that you can't Frieren if you love shonen action things or any other kind of more clean-cut presentation of a show in the anime space, but it does present a weird and interesting idea, is that Frieren is by far one of the more popular animes this season, and by the end of its first run, in its first season, it was the most popular anime of that season as well. And lots of people are really angry about the misses it's had in particularly the Anime Awards, because it's always constantly going up against JJK, and people feel like that's not fair, and people feel like JJK is winning awards from the previous one, and I totally get that, and I understand why people are frustrated with that. But I think Frieren is a really unique show. I think that it sits in a pantheon of shows that are oftentimes few and far between. And to give you an idea, I think the level of show that Frieren sits alongside is something like... Frieren sits alongside something like Cowboy Bebop. It sits alongside something like Fullmetal Alchemist, Brotherhood. It sits alongside these big, epic, incredibly well-crafted things that even if you don't like it, it forces you to recognize that it's well-made. It forces you to recognize that it is the peak of something, even if it isn't for you. And I think that's helped it negate a lot of, and don't worry, I'm not about to jump to I hate Frieren here, believe me. I think that's helped it negate a lot of its detractors, because even people who are not slice-of-life stuff, slower paced things aren't their ideal thing, they can look at it and say, holy crap, is this well made? Holy crap, is this kind of masterclass in animation, in storytelling, in all of that. And there's a thing that happens, and it still rears its head, actually more often than you think, in anime, on my anime list, in that Fullmetal Alchemist was number one with a bullet for a really long time in the My Anime List ranking. But the thing to understand about that is people were keeping it there. The big enough contingent of fans made the collective decision that we're going to keep this thing at the top. And we're just not going to allow it to dip below number one. And now I think that Frieren Season 2 and Season 1 and 2 are 1 and 2 respectively. But I'm sure there's something slightly similar happening there. Question any ranking that is done by votes where people get more than one vote per season, kind of thing. Just like so to give you a perfect example, part of the reason why there's always a blowout for certain shows or whatever the hot show is that particular year on the Crunchyroll Anime Awards is because the way the voting works is you don't get one vote. You get as many votes as you can cast. Actually, you get one vote a day, so you can show up the next day and cast all the same votes, and you can fortify your ballot over and over and over and over again. That's why you get things like in the first Anime Awards, and the Anime Awards, the Crunchyroll Anime Awards have always had the problem of something winning too much. The first year it was Yuri on Ice. Last time, I believe it was Solo Leveling was the unfortunate child of that. Before that, it was JJK. It will probably happen this year, too, because you're not even turning it into a popularity contest. You're turning it into a popularity contest judged by people who have the time to do judging more than once. So I don't have the time, or quite frankly, brain space, to show up every day and vote for the things I like every day without exception until they cut off voting. A teenage kid? Totally. A really dedicated hardcore fan? Totally. It feels a little bit like the CD sales thing for idol handshake events, if you're familiar with that idea in J-pop idol culture, which is basically, if you spend a certain amount of money on a J-pop idol's music release, you get a ticket to a handshake event where you get to meet the idol. But what this does is it encourages people to buy multiple of the CDs. It's a flawed popularity range because they don't really care about the popularity. They care about the big sales number and they care about the money. But in a situation where those things don't apply, you get stuff like the Anime Award issue. Now, that aside, Frieren is good enough to break through. That's a huge deal. It's a huge deal for something to be good enough as a show. Just be like, no, you should watch this. You should just watch it. And in its first season, it had less of the big, bombastic, incredibly well-animated fight sequences that it had in this season. But it also didn't need them. And this season is doing something. It's working with different terrain in a different location than it was in the first season. In the first season, it was very much about Frieren coming to terms with the death of somebody she probably loved, but didn't have the, not emotional maturity, but emotional awareness to appreciate that. And also didn't have the sense of time, in many ways still doesn't, have the sense of time to understand that the same circumstances she found herself in with Himmel wouldn't always exist. And also, she thought about that span of 10 years as something very small in comparison to the span of her life. And that's kind of the real genius of Frieren, is that they put the idea of being effectively immortal front and center, and they really detail out what that means. Frieren will essentially live forever. At least, as far as anyone she'll ever meet is concerned. But what does that look like? How does that set you apart from other people? When other people are aging and changing and just physically growing, literally, and you're the same little elf girl. Yes, you've grown since you were a young child, but you will live effectively forever. And there are very few of your kind around, and there are very few people who understand that. And one of them is an asshole in the form of Zarya. Zarya is just a jerk. To you and in general, but to you in particular. And that foregrounding of that, almost like, this is what it's really like to live for this long, doesn't really come completely into view until they do the final fight scene at the end of the, spoiler alert for the first season of Frieren, and the second season, by the way, if you haven't caught on to that. Towards the second season of the first season, there's a fight in a dungeon between Fern and Frieren and doppelganger, a shadow clone, essentially, of Frieren. Think Dark Link fight from Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time in the Water Temple, but two people fighting against Frieren. And Frieren and Fern fighting against also Frieren. And what Frieren says at the end there should catch you in a really specific way that's incredible, and that is when Fern all but kills her, Frieren activates this very nightmarishly dangerous, highly destructive magic. And she goes, "Good job, Fern. I haven't probably had to use that in over 100 years. No one's forced me to." And up until that point, you haven't seen Frieren really let loose because, in her words, there's just no point. She has presumably taught Fern all kinds of magic, but Fern exclusively uses what is considered to be the most basic offensive magic. And at one point, somebody's like, "You don't use many fancy spells." She's like, my mistress, meaning Frieren, taught me that this should suffice for wizards of this era. And that proves to be incredibly true. But what they're doing there with showing the fullest extent of Frieren's catalog of spells is they're showing you that, oh, she's past the I want to be the baddest ass in the land. She doesn't need to do that anymore. And she doesn't need to do that to such an extent that it's not important that she does. She'd rather learn spells for making sweet grape sour and vice versa, or any of the hilariously bizarre little grimoires that she manages to pick up along the way. And the other reason she does that is because of the person she is coming to understand that she truly loved, appreciated those kinds of spells. Her master before her, Flamma, her favorite spell was just one that created a field of flowers. And what's so good about Frieren is that it remembers what it tells you, and it carries that stuff forward and reinterprets it and shows it to you in a new way. So, in the first episode, you meet a character named Old Man Bull, and he's the guardian of this town because that town was the town where he and his wife lived and where his wife grew up, And so he protects it in her name, even though she's long dead. In this season, towards the end, you meet another dwarf character whose name is, I've got his name in my notes actually. But he is doing something similar. In his case, he commits to building a bridge for about 200 years because the village he lived in was decimated by monsters, and the nearest army was across the canyon, and only they couldn't get there because there was no way to get around the canyon easily. So as a result, he commits to building this bridge, and when Himmel and the party of heroes show up, Himmel helps him double down on that and sorry to the Carlin, it just stopped. Double down on that and say, our payment for helping you in this case is going to be making sure you build this bridge. And I can't find his name, unfortunately. But it's this show that becomes this conversation that is an echo about the past reaching forward and touching the present, and understanding that even if you will outlive everyone you've ever met, there's value in remembering them and in stopping to appreciate them while they're there, and holding those memories with you as you go forward. And I heard the Otakus Anonymous guys are watching this as part of their things they watch in the season. And Danny Mata, half of that duo, they lamented that Frieren was acquiescing to people's want for fight scenes in that show. Like I said, I think they're just in a different mode of the show. And the fight scenes aren't the point of the show, they never are. They are quick flourishes of splendor in a beautiful bouquet of a show. And what they also do is they're setting up the world to be more dangerous as they get closer to their goal. And with the after credits scene in the very last, actually, so maybe I think not 8th or 9th episode, because it's a 10-episode season, they give you a little moment with Dakin, who is clearly on his way to go visit his wife's grave, the way he mentioned towards the tail end of the first season. But at the very end of the show, after the part of the story you're getting with Frieren, Fern, and Stark concludes, they do the post-credit scene. If you watched the whole show but you didn't watch past the credits, I encourage you to go watch the post-credit scene at the very least. And it is Dakin getting an assignment to go fight one of the last real demon lords. It's clearly setting up the next arc and the next thing. But it is so... I noticed this a couple times, but specifically with music cues in the show. The show is choosing to be dangerous and to be more high octane in moments. I'm not gonna say who I had this argument with, but I had a conversation about One Piece with somebody, and I said the way female character designs were treated after the One Piece time skip really put me off, because I wasn't as prepared as I thought I'd be for the jump into sexiness that they took with the female characters. And the person on the other end argued, well, they consider themselves very sex positive, and that sounds like a me problem. And after thinking about it for a while, I came to the conclusion, on some level, it is a me problem. But on the other level, ascribing intention to the characters in a fictional thing, or to the setting in a fictional thing even, not only overemphasizes the fact that these characters are making these choices, because they're being written into these choices. Everything that's being done is being done by somebody, and these characters are created and being molded and shaped and used in very specific ways. So if you see a character who is all of a sudden incredibly objectified and sexualized, that is not a choice that character made, because fictional characters are incapable of making choices. If a writer is really good, they will make you feel like they made that choice. Or if you're particularly attached to a story, it'll make you feel like the character made that choice. But they didn't, because they don't exist. They're like, none of it exists. It's all made up and the points don't matter, so to speak. But my point there is that Frieren isn't capitulating. The author is just choosing to take the story in a different direction. is choosing to incorporate fight scenes in the show more often for narrative purposes and for intent to demonstrate a bigger arc and do something differently. Let's look at one of the shows I mentioned in the very beginning, Fullmetal Alchemist. Those characters feel real to people. They feel real to me when I'm watching this show. But it's all about writing the characters so that it feels that way. Writing specifically the world so it feels that way. Part of the advantage the show One Piece has is that it's running for so long that you have to know things. What does it look like to get a newspaper in a world where boats are some of the primary places people are spending their time? What does it look like? Even something like, and I've talked about this 9 million times, but Naruto. You know how the mail gets delivered if you've been watching Naruto steadily from the first episode until the most recent episode of Boruto. They had a section of Boruto where Boruto and the gang just delivered the mail. And there's something great about that because what it's doing is it's forcing the creator to write that, to be like, no, how would we get a newspaper to a boat? Like how does that work? And how does that work in the context of world in which all phones are also snails? What? And so you can kind of to everything you're seeing in an anime is an intentionally built piece of it. Why I bring that up is because the fight scenes in Frieren are there for a reason. They're there to demonstrate that they're in the northern lands, and the northern lands are notably still more volatile than where they came from. And they're also there for world building and to be a set piece and all this other really important stuff. But the long and short of it is that Frieren Fullmetal Alchemist is so adept at playing with... by the way, when I say that, both versions of Fullmetal Alchemist, the Brotherhood, which is the more true to original story version, and the 2004 version, both create a world and create all these rules and create all these antagonist characters and side characters and all this stuff, and they throw them all together and they make use of all of them. A lesser show than something like Fullmetal Alchemist or Frieren does not make use of a character like Fear Bradley. Fear Bradley is just kind of thing in the background in a lot of shows. A lesser show than Frieren wouldn't make use of Danken again. Wouldn't say, next season, we're getting right into giving Danken something to do. Or Masode. The other thing I like about Frieren is something I've talked about a lot with when it pertains to Jobless Reincarnation. It's that Frieren's characters aren't necessarily always likable. They are charming, and that's kind of the difference between a character like Rudius and a character like Frieren, is Frieren is a layabout and a lazy oaf and spends too much money, and she is incredibly knowledgeable about magic, but very not knowledgeable about a lot of other things. But they make her charming. The show makes her like a charming, weird, old, wise child kind of thing. And contrast that to someone like Rudius, who is incredibly uncharming, who is incredibly awkward and incredibly stilted and incredibly damaged, and his damage shows through in things that are considered to be deeply antisocial and not okay. But what they're doing with both characters is different but intentional. So in the case of Rudius, everybody always says you're not supposed to like Rudius, but I don't even think liking Rudius or hating him is the point. I think the point is that property is displaying a character who never stood a chance of being normal past the age of 13, or whenever in his previous life he got iced out and became a hikikomori. And yes, he should be held accountable for his actions. Anybody should. But the way he comes to them is much less intentional than even he would probably be willing to admit. A lot of his grossness, a lot of his weirdness, a lot of his just worst parts of otaku-ness come from a place of aloneness and exclusion and bullying and looking for anything to latch onto and oftentimes picking the wrong thing. You can see this in things as simple as the manosphere or incel culture or any of it. he is kind of a mirror of those things, just in a singular person, and it makes people really uncomfortable to think produce that kind of pressure can produce that kind of rotten diamond, so to speak. In Frieren's case, she has a similar pressure in the idea that she lost something important to her. But she didn't realize someone important to her. But she didn't realize that person was that important until after they passed. And then it hits her that she doesn't understand what she thought she understood. She needs to make a course correction. And a lot of this journey is her making that course correction. And her retracing her steps to remember. And in the 9th episode where she gets Himmel's journal, the moment where she sees Himmel's perspective of things that happened, and it comes to, oh, he saw me totally differently than I realized. It's a really important thing to her, and also people around her recognize, oh no, you should have that journal. That is not for me to take from you. But it's such a good show. If you are waffling on whether or not to give it a shot, I would absolutely give it a shot. But like I said at the very beginning of the episode, don't bring stuff to it. Let it do its thing for you, and you'll get a lot more out of it. It's not a show like JJK. It's not a bombastic shonen thing. It is a really slow, emotional burn, and there are great action scenes in it, but that's not its point. And it makes it pretty clear, even in the 2nd season where there are significantly more action set pieces, that the action set pieces are not its point. And hilariously, in the fight with the four-armed snake demon guy with the 4 swords and his henchman, Frieren removes herself from that fight entirely. She just doesn't engage with it. And I think the show did that for the purpose of saying, look, we're not going to give you the bombastic, no-holds-barred Frieren just wiping people from the map. We're going to give you, if we're going to have a fight scene, it's going to matter. And if we're going to have a fight scene that's going to be part of a smaller arc, it's going to matter, and we're going to figure out a way to make it matter, even if we have to almost artificially say, Frieren's just not going to participate in this. She's just going to let Fern do this fight. And the results of that fight come full circle, and the very first part of this season of the show come full circle by the very last episode, and you see something that Fern figured out how to do in that fight done again. And then the reason why they did that, why they took that monster hunting job, turned out not to be to free up this vein of special crystals to be mined, but to allow the adventurer who gave them the job to basically form a conservation zone for that area and to protect his home. And that's what Frieren brought up in the first episode. And they give you time with Frieren and Stark and even Fern, who takes out a locket that you haven't seen probably since the first episode, with a picture of her parents in it. And they have this whole conversation about, they're having a whole show about a celebration of home, a celebration of protecting your home, not aggressively in the way that, we're not talking about kicking out illegal aliens or any of that bullshit, but appreciating where you come from and making sure you have a place to go back to when you need it. And I thought this was, Frieren is always one of those shows that I really love sitting down with a drink at the end of the day and watching and letting it wash over me and be a thing that is, yes, is incredibly well made, but it has this mix of slice of life in Iyashike and a walkabout story, almost like something like Mushishi, that it's warm in a way that you don't get from a lot of things very often. And I think that in a universe that is increasingly defined by shonen that are getting darker and darker, and I talked about this in my conversation about a while back about Kaiju number 8 represents a shonen where the main character has given up on his dreams. And his dreams just aren't happening. And even in where the show currently is, his life is in danger every time he uses the power that allowed him to pursue his dreams. The acknowledgement that the traditional hero narrative can't quite fit the world we find ourselves in now. So it's nice to see a show that's just but regardless of how scary and angry and cruel the world is, there is value in doing good and value in remembering and value in the people next to you and treating the people next to you well and all of this other stuff. And on that note, that's where I'm going to leave it. I hope you liked the show. Hey, I hope you enjoyed the podcast, and if you did, be sure to subscribe wherever you're listening or watching. If you're listening to it on a podcast platform and they allow you to give a 5-star review, be sure to do that. If you're watching this on YouTube and you really liked what you saw, be sure to subscribe to the YouTube channel and like the video. In addition, if you want to make sure that you don't miss a beat, be sure to hit that notification bell so you know when new episodes drop. But if you're wondering, they drop every Thursday night Eastern time. And on that note, if you really love the podcast and you really love what I'm trying to do here, be sure to give the website a look. That website is bento-box.ghost.io. There will be a link in the description of either this podcast or this video. It'll also be linked in the description of the entire podcast on the information page. It'll also be linked in the description of the YouTube channel. So there's plenty of ways for you to get to that website and check it out. If you want to follow me, my social links are also listed in the footer of that page. So once again, go over there to find that stuff. But I hope you liked the episode. I look forward to talking to you next time. But until next time, I have been Alex. This has been Bento Radio, and I'll talk at you later.